Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Welcome to another video. It's been a little while, but I had a reason. I've been busy doing tours. Did two back-to-back tours up in the Northeast for peregrine falcons, sea ducks, wood ducks, stuff like that. And I don't do this very often, but this video I'm going to start out with some of my favorite images from those tours, and also provide you all with the dates for next year's tour for falcons, sea ducks, wood ducks, maybe even some snowy owls, stuff like that, in case you're interested in joining me and my co-leader, Mr. Harry Collins, on that tour. But after I share a few of my favorite images with you, I am going to go into a setting available on both the Canon R5 and the Canon R3. So those of you who are wondering if I was ever going to do another video on the R5 since I got my R3, yes, this one has to do with both the R5 and the R3. And there's a function as in both of these cameras, as you know if you've watched my videos, that I use to set up the very far right back button to activate spot autofocus. And that's the record and recall a shooting function, which you can find in the custom buttons setup of both of these cameras. And I want to go over not only how to set it up for that right back button, the very right back button autofocus, but also talk to you about how I used it a bit, actually quite a bit, on this past tour to quickly change exposures when the birds were flying, the peregrine falcons were flying, going from a bright sun to a shadowed shade area, and how valuable that was to getting the exact exposure I wanted in both of those lighting situations when that change happens instantly, when it crosses that line. So if you're interested in seeing some of the images from the tour and also learning a bit about how I'm using that function, stay tuned. Okay, moving on to the instructional part of this video. We're going to go into the customized buttons, and right now I'm working on the Canon R5, but the R3 is very similar. All of the critical functions that you want to activate for the setups I'm talking about here are in both cameras. There's just a couple additional ones in the R3, but all of the ones that you need, again, are also available in the R5. So if we go into the customized buttons and we move on down, now like I said in the intro, we're working on what I call the far right back button, which is actually the autofocus point button or the autofocus point select button, which I have assigned to register and recall a shooting function. And if we go in there and we go to the detail set, so if you hit the info button now, you will see that inside the register recall shooting function submenu, you have quite a few items here that you can activate or choose not to activate. So what I'm going to talk about first is setting up the far right back button for a specific type of autofocus, either if you want to call it area or method, because they are different. On the Canon R5 it's called a method, and on the Canon R3 it's called a autofocus area. So here we go. To set this up now to be just a way to activate spot autofocus, which I find extremely important to have available basically at the push of a button, the far right button in this case, just moving my thumb over to that button, instantly getting to spot because of the way these mirrorless autofocus systems work. This is how I have it set up currently. So white balance is checked, autofocus method of course is checked, and in this case if we move over there it's spot autofocus because that's what I want the camera to initiate when I hit this back button. Tracking sensitivity, accel decel tracking, and then of course autofocus operation set to on, all of these functions checked. So then if you go and you hit, if you set it up this way and you're shooting and you hit that far right autofocus point button, it's going to do everything that you have check marked here in this register and recall a shooting function menu. In this case, it's going to initiate spot autofocus. It's going to use a white balance of 6100K. It's going to use a tracking sensitivity of -1. It's going to use an accel decel tracking of a +2. And it's going to autofocus, servo autofocus in this case, because we have servo autofocus turned on in the main autofocus menu. So that's how you set it up if you want that button to initiate spot autofocus with these parameters. Now, I also mentioned a customized setting for taking care of and shooting in a scenario where a bird is flying very quickly from a well-lit area. Let's say on the left-hand side, you're panning left to right, and landing on a perch that's in a shadowed area. So very different exposures. Now, I know what some of you are going to think right away, and that's, well, why don't you just set a priority mode or auto ISO or something like that? Well, first of all, those depend on the meter and the likelihood that the meter is going to meter correctly for the bird in the new light situation, the shade, is not great. And also, by shooting a priority mode or auto ISO, you're going to have a scenario where it's going to change one parameter of your exposure. And what if you want to tweak all three to get the exact exposure that you want? The shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. And by using this method, you can do that. And so we're going to go into the custom buttons, autofocus point button, or the autofocus point select button, as I like to call it, the far right back button. You can do this for any of the 3 back buttons that can be used for autofocus initiation, the autofocus on button, the asterisk button, or the button I choose to use, which is the far right one on the back of the camera. Now, right now it's set up, if we go in here, we went into the autofocus point select button. You can see it's set up for register and recall a shooting function. And now if we hit the info button, we're going into that sub menu, and you can see what I have set up right now for that button to initiate is only a white balance setting, an autofocus method, and then you have a tracking sensitivity setting, an XL decel tracking setting, and of course we want it to autofocus. But now let's get into that really quick and distinct exposure change from bright sun to shade, a bird flying very quickly, so you don't have time to change anything, you know, as far as moving your dials and all that kind of stuff. What we're going to do now is we're going to have this button initiate other things, including shooting mode, which is going to be manual, shutter speed. Now I'm going to set this for something in a shutter speed that isn't really practical, but I'm indoors, so I can't actually demonstrate in the real lighting situation. So I'm going to have to set it, I'm going to set it very slow. I'm going to set it for 1/30th of a second here, because I want it, when I demonstrate the change in exposure, I want it to be very, very noticeable to you on the video here of what it's doing. So I'm going to go really slow, but here, let's say when the bird was in the sun, you would be shooting at 1/4000th of a second at f6.3 at ISO 1000, let's say, and that would have been the correct exposure for the bird in the sun. But as it flies quickly into the shade, you're going to want to change to a brighter exposure. Here we're going really bright, not realistic, but for demonstration purposes, it's what I want. Aperture will go all the way wide open to f4, let's say, and an ISO speed, let's drop that down a little bit. I don't think we want an ISO speed that high. Let's go to, let's say, 6400. Metering mode, we don't, so we got to make sure that we put check marks in these now, because that means when you press that button, it's going to initiate a manual exposure of 1/30th of a second at aperture f4 at ISO speed 6400. Let's say that's tailored to the bird being exposed correctly in that shaded area, now that perched area that it's flying into. No exposure compensation. And now we'll change the autofocus method, though, to the same method, let's say, that we're using to track the bird when it was in the full light scenario. So let's go ahead and go to face detect with tracking. And let's say we even have eye detect on top of that set up in the main autofocus menu of the camera. So now this is what you're going to get when you press, for me, the far right autofocus point select button. So let's go ahead and back out of here, back to the shooting scenario, and you can see that for the bird in the sun, when it's flying in the sun, coming from left to right, moving toward the shaded area, we're shooting, when it's in the sun, we're shooting at 1/3200th of a second at f7.1 at ISO 1000. But the minute, the second, the split second, really, that it's going to go into the shade, I'm going to press the right, I'm going to go from pressing the autofocus on button, let's say, that's what I was using, and that's using this exposure for the bright area. I'm going to quickly move my thumb over, split second, that's all it takes to move your thumb, over to the far right autofocus button, which is the point, autofocus point select button, and boom, much brighter. That now is at 1/30th of a second, f4 at ISO 6400, the settings we set up in the register and recall a shooting function menu for that button. That's what it's doing when we're shooting with the autofocus on button. It's using the 1/3200th of a second, f7.1 at ISO 1000. Instantly we can go to 1/30th of a second, f4 at ISO 6400, much brighter. So that's the point of using this register and recall a shooting function set up for going from to go from one to another very different exposure setting, switching not only one parameter like you would get if you shoot aperture priority or shutter priority or auto ISO, but potentially tweaking all three parameters of your manual exposure to get the bird exposed exactly right in the shaded area going from a sunny area. Moving your thumb only takes a split second, and it can be done, and that's what I was doing in a scenario with the Falcons going from sun to shade. That line was distinct, and it happened in an instant. You had to have a way, or I had to have a way, to make this exposure change instantly. Otherwise, you couldn't do it. And so that is one of the awesome things about the Canon R3 and the Canon R5. You can make these adjustments. You can use these functions, this register and recall a shooting function, in many different ways. I just talked about two different scenarios and how I use them. One, to institute a different type of autofocus method, basically keeping the exposure the same. Also instituting or keeping the same autofocus method, but changing the manual exposure settings greatly for a scenario going from full sun to shade, flying bird, making that transition in an instant. Okay, so I hope you found this video entertaining, the first part, and also informative, obviously the second part, when we went over the record and recall a shooting function setup in both the R3 and the R5. If you did, really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. It's subscribers like you that keep this channel going. So until next time, be safe. I hope you have great light, take great pictures, and I'll see you soon.